Since the country's unification in 928, England has been for the most part one of the most culturally homogeneous nations in Europe. For almost all of history, from Plymouth to Newcastle, Carlisle to Canterbury, if you would ask anyone what country you were in, you would be proudly told England. Of course, for all the national and cultural unity in the world can't stop even the smallest of regional rivalries from forming. No matter where you look in England, there's always one country, city, or town out to get another. Perhaps even you watching have a distrust for a neighbouring town or city, or believe them as out to get your own. Maybe you're from Coventry and secretly view neighbouring Birmingham with envy or disgust. Or maybe you're from Sunderland and really wish those Geordies in Newcastle weren't so up themselves over football. Yeah, this is going to be one of those look at this cool rock I found kind of videos, but hey, I'm not fussed. This kind of niche England lore is something I live for, and if you're still here at this point then you probably do too. So hey, let's look at some of these local rivalries, and perhaps we can get a better understanding of how these kinds of rivalries form and what place they have in our modern society, and maybe, just maybe, we can learn to take them all a little less to heart. Before we can take a look at the rivalries themselves, we need to, like always, have a look at how we got here. For much of England's history, the idea of a city having its own identity, let alone a rivalry with another, was almost completely unheard of. Instead, the rivalries were often centred on the families and institutions they were named after or held sway over the cities, rather than the cities themselves. Of course, the first city to develop an identity of its own was London. By being the seat of the monarchy and home to most of the country's wealthy and educated, London developed its reputation as a cosmopolitan city of trade, science and majesty. It would take until the High Middle Ages for the next string of cities to come into their own. With the increasing trade networks across the English Channel and the North Sea, cities like Bristol developed their identity as major port cities. Quick side note, yes, this is the official flag of Bristol. Yes, it is f***ing atrocious. Anyway, moving on. Their ports acted as the centrepiece and lifeblood of their respective cities, so their culture and architecture came to reflect that. Other cities, less interested in mercantile affairs, developed their culture and reputations off of their devotion to the heavens above. Cities like Lichfield, Worcester, and especially Canterbury became beacons of Christendom and learning. Then, of course, there was York. Not content with being a one-trick pony, it would go on to be both a major port and a major cathedral city. As the Industrial Revolution pulled into the station, many cities, especially in the north of England, began to flourish as they became exporters of many of the world's goods and materials. As such, the next wave of cities began to shape their own identities based heavily around their main export. Cities like Leeds and Manchester built their riches off of the production and exporting of cloth, while cities like Newcastle and Sheffield were built off of the back of their foundries and the production of iron and steel. Their communities became defined by their trades, and so did the cities around them. Unfortunately, no city is safe from the whims of human nature, and for every us, there's always a them. In the beginning, before York's infamous rivalry with Lancaster, even before there was an England for the two to fight over, there was only one city rivalry greater than any other: York versus Canterbury. You see, the oldest and often strangest city rivalries are the one that predate the Industrial Revolution. With these rivalries, you won't see the people themselves cheering on their home city, but rather their schools, churches, and noble houses. York and Canterbury's feud stems over their battle for supremacy over English religion. Despite York coming out on top as the bigger and more important city, Canterbury was enshrined into law as the dominant cathedral by King Henry VIII in 1539. So this rivalry has effectively been over for nearly 500 years. Unfortunately, it's impossible to talk about these rivalries without mentioning York versus Lancaster. Their rivalry famously stemmed over their noble houses duking it out over the throne of England, or so the story goes. Believe it or not, the idea of this being a city rivalry is actually a misconception. Neither York nor Lancaster themselves had anything to do with the conflict at all. Both York and Lancaster were both actually firmly in the red team, whereas the House of York was mostly in the south. Now, before I melt into a little puddle for attempting to talk about the War of the Roses, I'm going to move on. So, Oxford and Cambridge! Quite unsurprisingly, Oxford and Cambridge have been historical rivals for hundreds of years off the backs of their prestigious universities, with the two universities attempting to outdo each other at the sheer amount of wankers they could accrue into their numbers. This rivalry dates all the way back to the founding of Cambridge University, which was actually founded by disgruntled Oxford scholars. Thankfully, with the increased number of universities throughout the years and the decay of the Oxbridge monopoly on higher education, this rivalry has been firmly subdued quite a bit. It's now mostly relegated to just ceremonies and sporting events. Not that interesting anymore. Some cities, like the aforementioned industrial cities in the north of England, don't have centuries-long histories and institutions to build the backs off of, so they have to turn to more contemporary means for their rivalries. As I discussed in the old Leeds video, Leeds and Sheffield grew at the same time, becoming the vanguards of their respective industries. By the late 19th century, the two had become the largest cities in Yorkshire, consistently taking the top spot from each other. This proximity and prosperity made them natural rivals. As I mentioned all that time ago, Leeds initially applied for city status out of a staunch desire to not be outdone by their southern neighbour. From there, Leeds and Sheffield would spend most of the next 100 years competing for funding and economic dominance. Even as recently as 2010, a group of Sheffield MPs kicked up a fuss over the funding of Leeds' own indoor arena, lest it damage the profits and prestige of Sheffield's own arena. While this intercity rivalry technically never died, Leeds would come out on top in the 21st century as not only Yorkshire's largest city, but one of the UK's largest, larger than Sheffield, Liverpool and Manchester. Leeds and Manchester, Northern England's two largest cities, have very little in terms of rivalry, only side-eyeing each other now and again. Go team, I guess? Sometimes, these kinds of rivalries just develop from one city overstepping on another city's turf. As I mentioned before, the city of Bristol was for centuries England's premier port, rivalled only by London itself. Until a once small fishing village called Liverpool had come to dominate not only England's trade flow, but the whole world's. Naturally, the two cities would come to spend the bulk of the 19th century trying to outdo each other in any way they could, though, as shipping moved from Bristol and Liverpool to the more spread-out East Coast ports on Middlesbrough and Grimsby, that little rivalry of theirs would fade into relative obscurity. Sometimes, when the rivalry of economics becomes one-sided, and I mean comically one-sided, it ends up turning up into straight-up jealousy. The proud city of Coventry, once one of England's largest, was a bit late to the party with the Industrial Revolution. As such, it would end up falling behind its neighbour Birmingham. This fall from grace would create some resentment on the part of Coventry, with many within the ancient city seeing folks from Birmingham as Dickensian paupers with sooty faces and funny accents. Harsh. And then there's the one that you've most likely been roped into if you're from my neck of the woods. Even if it's not your city's centuries-old institutional heritage, even if it's not your city's major trades or industrial past, even if your city has nothing to offer a curious tourist, there's always football. Probably the most famous modern rivalry on the list, and the one at the top of the thumbnail, Liverpool versus Manchester. Manchester and Liverpool grew up to be two of the Victorian era's wealthiest cities. As such, they'd have all the money in the world to commit to their cultural endeavours, most notably their collective 4 association football teams. As such, Manchester and Liverpool have some of the most noteworthy association football teams in the world, with a constant keen desire to outdo each other. Naturally, their rivalry is perhaps the fiercest in England. Now, I've never willingly watched a domestic football game in my life. I know next to nothing about football or the intricacies that go into it, so you won't get any of that from me. What I can tell you though is that even as someone completely detached from the game, as someone who's neither Liverpudlian nor Mancunian, the rivalry between the two cities and their football teams ripples all across the UK, and at times even into mainland Europe. From the infamous tramplings in Sheffield and Brussels, to unprovoked assault in London, to what the Liverpolitan newspaper affectionately refers to as the Battle of Everton Valley, Violence and hooliganism are a rather unfortunate and especially noteworthy problem between Liverpool and Manchester. The violence between the two cities, their football teams, and the respective fans are a stain on English culture and its beloved game. Unfortunately, due to how entrenched hooligan culture is, and the rivalry is in our culture, it's a problem that's going to persist well into the future, unfortunately. Only time will tell. In an increasingly cold and complex world that's increasingly isolating, yet seemingly has never been more connected, it's easy to try and find belonging in your local culture and the rivalries that only often strengthen it. It's easy to let your local pride get the best of you and let it drive you to less than savoury places. That's why it's always important to take a step back and question how much you want to internalise these sorts of things. Community is important, but never let your attachment cloud your judgment, especially if these rivalries have never actually directly affected you. Unless, of course, you're from London. Unsurprisingly, London, with its 8 million more people than the next largest UK city, has no time or care for city rivalries. They're too busy coating their pots and pans in gold and hiding hordes of counterfeit American goods off the shores of the Cayman Islands to care about petty squabbles. Remember to stay vigilant out there, folks. Good night.